People have to join it through the YouTube link, is it?
Yeah, people have to join
Which
through
was
the
mentioned on
YouTube.
the flyer.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they will
yeah.
join through the YouTube. Only the panelist is on the WebEx. Start. So, good afternoon. Warm welcome on behalf of All India Institute of Medical Sciences, UNICEF, and WHO India Country Office to all the participants who have joined for this special webinar on COVID in children. We all know that India is faced with unsurmountable, I would say, like a calamity in which large number of adults and few children are getting affected and becoming positive for COVID. I am so happy that today with me we have 4 experts who have treated hundreds of patients in the first pandemic, and still they are managing COVID positive children who are presenting and getting admitted to the hospital and in home isolation. So I have with me on my left side Professor Sushil Kabra, who is heading the pulmonology unit. He is full professor in Department of Pediatrics at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And on my other side is Professor Rakesh Lodha, who is in charge for the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at AIIMS, New Delhi. We have the privilege of having 2 more experts from the country. One is Dr. Jayashri Muralidharan from PGI Chandigarh, who heads the Intensive Care Unit and the Emergency Services at Advanced Center for Child Health in Chandigarh. We also have Dr. Tanu Singhal, who is Pediatric Infectious Disease Consultant at Kokila Ben Dhirubhai Ambani Hospital and Medical Research Center in Mumbai. We would be taking live questions through the WhatsApp, through the YouTube, and we will try to cover as many questions during the next 90 minutes. I think it is our responsibility at this point of time that we need to allay the fear from the many of the parents who has children who have COVID infection. And then we also need not create a panic at this point of time, as you will hear that COVID in children majority of the time is asymptomatic or only mild, is having mild disease. I am also very happy that with us we have from WHO India Country Office Dr. Pushpa Chaudhary, who is the team lead for reproductive, maternal, child and adolescent health, who has joined. So may I ask Dr. Pushpa Chaudhary to say few words to the attendees. Dr. Pushpa.
He needs to unmute.
Kindly unmute yourself.
Yeah, a very good afternoon to all of you. Dr. Diviradi, Luisi from UNICEF, panel experts, and doctors who have joined us online. Greetings to all of you on behalf of Country Office WHO India. I'm glad that this webinar is being organized today and congratulate AIMS team for this timely and important initiative. As we know that more and more pediatric cases are being reported and being managed at health facilities during this current COVID-19 surge. And among these, children are presenting with serious illnesses requiring hospitalization and intensive care as well. As we are getting new information every day and evidence emerging from studies and clinical trials from around the world, and you have own personal experiences as well as expertise, it is very important treating with COVID-19, treating children with COVID-19 disease to have clear and actionable guidelines that takes into account the settings of the public health sector as well as the larger to smaller setups in private sector. I applaud the Department of Pediatrics, AIMS New Delhi, for taking lead last year in October and November and organizing a series of webinars for the WHO Regional Office of Southeast Asia, guided and supported by Dr. Rajesh Mehta and Dr. Rana, wherein all aspects of COVID-19 in children, including pathogenesis, clinical features, diagnosis and COVID-19 in children, management of multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children were addressed very well. We would like to record our appreciation to Professor Capra and Professor Lodha for having developed the standard treatment guidelines and updating these guidelines quickly based on current evidence. Your work has proved to be of immense value in supporting the government of India in finalizing the standard treatment protocols for healthcare professionals across the country. So thank you, Dr. Devrari and UNICEF for taking the lead today in organizing this webinar. Frequently asked questions are very interesting and useful way to share and disseminate useful information, particularly for families. And I look forward for the discussion that will follow shortly. So with these few words, I would like to over.
Dr. Pushpa, I am very sure our experts are going to speak scientific information based on evidence, which is going to be authentic, reliable information, how to manage the families and how to manage children who are suffering with COVID at home and in healthcare facility. So I also have another person from his chief of health at UNICEF, my friend Luigi. So over to you, Luigi. Kindly address the attendees and the experts.
Good afternoon, Dr. Devrari. A warm welcome from my side as well on behalf of UNICEF. At the outset, let me thank everyone who has put his or her time and effort and competencies and experience in organizing this session. It is of critical importance. Let me also thank all those who are listening today for being here, and not only for listening, but also for please disseminating the learnings that we will have today across your own platforms and constituencies. I know that you are all here to listen to the experts, not to me, so let me be as short as I can and share a few reflections. First, the evidence is growing and is fast changing, but we live at the moment in a health system that is heavily challenged. So we need to be sure that we can act fast and in a flexible way. To do that, we need, first of all, to get together and share data and case studies across the fraternity of all those who operate and deal with children. In this scenario, I hope and trust that this will be a first of many other events to follow where evidence can be shared and used for learning. Second, of course, we need protocols and guidelines, again, for everybody across the sector, from community to tertiary hospitals who deals with children and adolescents, to know what to do, when to do, and where at the right time. And again, I trust that the session of today will bring more knowledge and clarity in this regard. Third, we need, as we sail through this tragedy, to understand what are the bottlenecks in terms of provision of pediatric care. Is the equipment, are the supplies, are the medicines available, the right ones for children, or what is needed, or what do we need to change? That will help tweak the response as we go. Fourth, we need to keep families and the public informed. And in that regard, please do not hesitate to use our channels as UNICEF and I'm sure WHO as well to disseminate simple information to families. This will help protect the others in the family in case of sick children. It will protect to manage fears and panic. Eventually, it will protect or help not to further overwhelm the health system in these days. A very last thought from me before passing the word back to you, Dr. Diorari. As you said at the outset, and we will hear it later, most of children affected by COVID are not facing severe illness. But let us also please, as a community of managers and practitioners working with children and for children, let us not forget that children need another enormous amount of services in addition to treatment of COVID-19. We still need to be able as a community to deal with needs of safe births, vaccinations, pediatric care for any other condition. So I really trust that the community that is gathering today will consider this as another big priority as we sail through this, and I'm sure that we will sail through this together with the best possible outcomes for children and their families. Thanks again to everybody, and over from my side.
Thank you, Luigi, stressing how important it is to learn from the data and evidence, stressing how important is for making sure our health system is geared up for taking care of these children. Also stressing on guidelines, which have to be national guidelines to be followed in the country, and then taking care of the families. And lastly, as you said, we have to maintain all essential maternal, newborn, and child health services while this pandemic is on, especially the immunization services. They should not be hit. Now, let me get to my first slide. The format of this frequently asked question is, what we are going to do is, first, we will have some structured questions which we have collected from a lot of doctors and even from the parents. And then online, we would take questions which will keep on coming. They will be supplemented. Third thing, what we will do is we will share with you the guidelines for management of children who have got COVID infection, and then few common scenarios, and at the last, carry home messages from this webinar. So we are going to start with common question with the parents will ask the pediatrician. And my first question goes to Dr. Tanu from Mumbai. Tanu, looking at this pandemic, which is the second wave, do you think there is increase in infection during this second surge of COVID in children?
Yes, I think so. While we don't have absolute correct data, but perception is that children are getting more commonly infected and symptomatic in this second surge as compared to the first surge.
So, what do you think is the reason behind that you say that there is more children who are getting affected during the second wave?
I feel that it is multiple reasons, but one reason could be, at least here in Maharashtra, that it seems to be a mutant or a variant virus which is more infectious. We know that children are less susceptible to infection as compared to adults. In fact, there was a study which showed that it was 50% less. But if your virus is more infectious, then children get infected. The other reason could be that, children have not been going out at all in the first few months of the pandemic. And then as the relaxation started and as the number of cases went down, children also started going out for play and also for other medical care, etc., and they got infected. So I think there are multiple reasons, but it is also related to the change in the nature of the virus and also relaxation of precautions.
And I'm very sure not adhering to COVID appropriate behavior by the seniors in the family also may be responsible for this. Let me ask Rakesh Lodha. Rakesh, yesterday ICMR shared the data of children who were affected in wave 1 and in wave 2. Can you allude to that data?
They shared some data which seemed to suggest that overall proportion of individuals below 20 years, that's how they categorize, is not very different for what was there in that first wave, if you could say. The numbers are currently about 5.8% is what the figure they quoted as compared to about 4.5% or so in the previous round. So there's some increase, but that's not a substantial increase. As the denominator or number of people who are infected, that has gone up. So even this 5% would appear to be, more than 4% previously, because there we weren't seeing as many cases. So overall, as a proportion, probably, there's not much change, and all the various factors which Dr. Tanu and Dr. Derari have highlighted, they may have contributed to a slight increase in overall cases.
So as Rakesh rightly said, yesterday, Dr. Balram Bhargav and Vinod Paul shared in the media, social media, that the proportion of patients who are getting admitted between 1 to 19 years of age is 5.8% in this wave as compared to the previous wave, which was 4.2%. And rightly so, as Rakesh is saying, because the number of adults also has increased, the exposure to children is more. So there is little bit slight increase in the number of children who are getting admitted in the hospital. Slight. So let me ask Tanu. Tanu, what are the common symptoms? Are these different? You have seen a lot of patients in Mumbai during the second wave. Are these different or are these the same?
So basically, they remain the same. The common symptoms are fever, sore throat, cough, blocked nose, etc. But what we are finding this time is that the fever is higher and it lasts for a longer time. That is something which is different that we are seeing, because earlier, the child would just have maybe little bit of fever for a day and get better. But this time the symptoms do appear to be a little more severe, and which makes people, a lot of parents reach out to pediatricians because the symptoms are not better. Apart from that, we've seen adolescents, especially those who are above the age of 12 or 13 years, to come with persistent fevers going on for 6 to 7 days, like what many adults with COVID also experience. So this is just a perception, but the symptoms do appear to be more severe and persistent this time as compared to last. We are also seeing children coming in with diarrhea and vomiting and fever. Of course, that was seen in the first time too.
So may I ask Sushil to add on to this? Sushil?
Yes, sir. One is that we should be aware the difference in getting the test done in June, July, May, June, July last year. It was very difficult to get a PCR test done, and now it is easily available. And once we increase the number of tests specifically for children, so number of cases are going to increase, though they increase in proportion has increased. Second thing is how they are getting it. It is most of the time it is a airborne infection which is happening to children, and a small proportion may be because of fomites. There may be a lot of controversy regarding whether the fomites are responsible for transfer of the transmission of the infection. But major thing is that the adult members of the family, specifically siblings, and they are going to school, they are going for the play, and that's why there is a increase in the transmission of the disease in children, and second thing is ease of getting the PCR done on children.
So, slide. So my next question again goes to Sushil. Sushil, how do children acquire infection, COVID infection?
As I said, sir, it is by the majority of this part would be by the airborne infection, either some adult member, elder sibling, or if the child is going out playing with other peers or some school. These are the reason for transfer. And as I clarified, that very small proportion is because of the fomites.
Okay, so basically this infection is airborne infection, and then someone in the family may be positive, and from that person the child is going to get the infection. This is the most common reason. And then as we know that children go out to the school or mix with the other children, if someone else has got infection from there also, the child can get the infection. Rakesh, you want to add something?
No, sir.
Is it okay?
That's fine, sir.
Okay. So, slide. Okay, Sushil, if one member in a family is positive, should we screen all the children in the family, even if they are asymptomatic?
Yes, sir. The infectivity of the virus is reasonably high, and that's why if there is one member suffering from COVID in whole of the family, it is likely to be positive. And now the question is that when there is no specific treatment and the children are going to recover, then whether there is a need for doing a test. So there are two aspects of doing the test. One is that if though very small proportion, less than 0.1% will develop a disease, severe disease requiring hospitalization. So if a child is develops a disease, say five days down the line, in that case, if we want to admit him, as of now, all hospitals will need a paper that it is a COVID positive. And as of now, it may take 12 hours to 24 hours earliest possible to get a RT-PCR result. So that's why we would suggest that if there is a one adult member suffering from COVID positive, all children or household should be tested, provided that they are symptomatic or at least 5 days of contact, not in the beginning itself. Second thing is, if we know that this child is really infected, we should try to curtail the infection transmission to the other family members, specifically grandparents, because children will stay, play, and may transmit the infection to grandparents. So that's why it is reasonable to get a test done on all children if they are symptomatic at that time, or otherwise after 5 to 7 days of contact with the COVID positive adult. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sushil. Let me ask Rakesh, what test should be done in a child in whom we are suspecting that he may be suffering from COVID?
Okay, so the diagnostic test modalities remain same across the age groups. The main modality is use of PCRs or RT-PCR. One is the RT-PCR, and then we have the CBNAT platform, GeneXpert and TrueNAT, which could be used. And these are done on respiratory specimen collected by nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal swab. Now, this would be the main modality. And the second option, which would also be there, is that the rapid antigen test, whether that could also be used in scenarios, particularly symptomatic children, where in scenarios where RT-PCR testing facility may be limited or the system may be overloaded and the reporting time may be quite high. So in that setting, rapid antigen test may be there, remembering that the sensitivity would be lower than that of a nucleic acid amplification based testing. And a negative test doesn't rule out infection. So once we keep this in mind, we could use these tests appropriately.
So Rakesh, what do you think in case we are suspecting COVID infection in a child and our RT-PCR test is coming negative, we believe clinically he looks like COVID, should we repeat the test?
So as Dr. Kabra mentioned that, it would depend on when we are testing. So in a symptomatic child, test negative and if there's a strong suspicion and family members are positive, there's a fair likelihood that we may get that even a negative test wouldn't rule out COVID infection. So we need to keep that in mind. The second is very often people get the kids tested as soon as they are picked up to have the infection or if they have symptoms. So there would be some component which would be negative. It also is dependent on the way the sampling has been done. So if the sampling is inadequate, then we may get a false negative test. So these are things that we just need to keep in mind and manage accordingly.
So what do you think if the new mutant virus, what Tanu was mentioning, in that this test is going to work, or?
So from what we understand, the platforms or various tests that have been approved by the ICMR and again the tests which are available across the world, approved by the respective regulators, have kind of they're targeting the more conserved sequences of the coronavirus. The first one, the E gene, is a gene sequence which is conserved across the beta coronaviruses. And at this time, because we don't have the other serious ones in circulation, like the SARS-1 or the MERS, we presume that would be there. And then the others are typically the open reading frame gene segments, which are reasonably conserved. So at this time point, people would believe that these tests are going to pick up these mutants. And anyway, the sequencing and looking at the negative samples which have tested negative for on PCR. Some of those are also being sequenced to figure out whether carry many of these other viruses which may be missed by the PCR.
So Rakesh, in PCR test, RT-PCR, how do we interpret the value of CT value?
Sir, yes, the CT value is the cycle threshold value, which kind of just indirectly gives us an idea about the viral load. It's just the time point or number of cycles at which the amplicon can be detected by the technique, which means a lower CT value would indicate a high viral load. So that's what it does. Now, what we need to remember is that, and there are certain cutoffs that the agencies have decided for reporting, positive and negative tests. Apart from that, once a test is reported positive, let's say a CT value of 20 would indicate a higher viral load as compared to CT value of 30. The only issue is that when we are taking a sample from the respiratory tract, the way we are doing it, it's not a very standardized thing. So from a given individual, X amount may be coming, from another one, another amount is coming. So the exact idea about the viral load cannot still be made out. And I think there are studies which have clearly shown that there doesn't seem to be any relationship between the so-called the CT value at the initial time of diagnosis and the severity of the disease. So I don't think we need to worry about the CT value as long as the report. We just need to look at a positive test and a negative test and not really worry about the CT report.
So I would request all the attendees, if you have any questions, keep on asking on the WhatsApp. WhatsApp number is 789-43-99997. Can you show the slide? The WhatsApp number is So the WhatsApp number is 789-43-99997. Can we go to the next one? So my next question goes to Jayashri from Chandigarh. Jayashri, how do you manage a child who is COVID positive, or if there is a family member who is COVID positive? Jayashri. Unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear
Yeah.
you, Jayashri.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So this scenario where a child is positive and a family member is positive is probably one of the commonest scenario that we are seeing. in the second wave as well as in the early pandemic that we saw last year. Because as you have already heard the discussion, the infection tends to be in family clusters. So the management for a child who's COVID positive, therefore, would, especially if it is a mild illness, which we have already seen, the heartening part is that in children, majority of the infections are mild. So is home isolation along with the family. And the fever is treated with simple paracetamol, which is given, you measure the temperature every 6th hourly, and a fever which is 100 or more than 100 is treated with paracetamol in a dose of about 10 to 15 milligram per kg per dose. Good hydration, the normal feeding or the diet should continue, and there are no other medications that are required at this stage. However, the children who are on home isolation and are monitored telephonically by pediatricians, the parent should be told about what to monitor, whether there is an increase in the respiratory rate, does the child become breathless, is there some unexplained irritability, is the fever very high grade and persisting for more than 4 days. And as you have already heard that this time around, the fever tends to persist for a longer time than what happened last year. And also the range of fever is a little higher than what we saw last year. So these are some of what we call as some kind of warning signs which have to be explained to the parents so that they can monitor the child at home. So this is the simplistic treatment that we would give for a child who has mild illness and is on home isolation.
And what about if some family member is positive? What should be done?
It always happens that there would be some family member, some member or the other from the family who is positive along with the child, because the contact for that infection would be from an adult family member. So in that particular case comes the question of isolating the child. So we have seen that in nuclear families, when we advise isolation, it becomes really difficult, especially if the mother or the father is positive with COVID, then it becomes very difficult to isolate the child. So therefore, the child is better left with the mother, and hand hygiene and other simple such precautions have to be told and explained to the parents, and they have to be carried out stringently. We also heard that very often we see that many of the families, they send the child to the grandparents. Now here there is a little bit of risk. If the child is positive, it is better not to send to grandparents, because then there is a higher risk of infecting the older grandparents who have a higher risk of getting into problems. And if the child is asymptomatic and not tested, then it is better that we test and then send to the grandparents if it is negative. So these are some of the precautions that one needs to follow.
So I think you answered majority of the questions. My one more question to you is, can children be super spreader also?
Yes, sir. Children are actually, they are like, they can get the infection from the adults as well as they can be the spreader for the infection, especially to the grandparents and the older or parents or with people with comorbidity. So both ways it can happen.
So even they can give it to the other kids.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to remember as parents. If they are parents are positive, make sure the child is negative before he goes out. So his activities outside also should be. Sushil, you would like to add on this? Yes. So that is very, very important. So again, next question goes to Jayashree. I think you already mentioned. Jayashree, what is the role of giving prophylactic medications to a child who is exposed to COVID positive adult in the family?
So there is no role of any prophylactic medications once a child is exposed to a COVID positive family member. There are no such medications that we can give which can prevent the child from contracting the infection. So it is more of social distancing. Just a bit about masks, since we talk of masks very often in adults. In children, it is a win-win situation. Like, it's not easy to mask the children. If we look at WHO guidelines, they talk about using masks in children between 6 to 12 years of age. Less than this, there are problems, and therefore, and the kind of mask should be more of a fabric mask, which has an elastic band which can be easy for the child to wear rather than the one which adults use, the tying ones, that is not feasible in children. But children with immunodeficiency or those who are on cancer chemotherapy or have underlying comorbidities which can predispose them to, who are at high risk for a severe, moderate, or severe COVID infection, in them we can probably recommend medical masks. But there are a lot of problems in keeping the children masked. So we have to kind of balance the feasibility versus the utility and the protective part about the masks.
So I think you already mentioned World Health Organization mentions use of mask above 5 years of age. Rakesh, you want to add something on
No,
use of mask?
I think I would agree with what Dr. Jayashree mentioned. It's just that less than 5 years, generally masking is, there would be feasibility issues. It's not recommended. And even in children who are older, they need appropriate masks. Need to be concerned about their safety, and there has to be supervision. Some children may be able to handle these masks very well, whereas others may find it difficult. So it's better that we use it in a selected population, which would have to be supervised. And beyond that, 12 years and above, universal masking, as has been recommended for adults, particularly when they're going out and all, in that scenario, that has to be done. It would have a role, but I think the more important thing probably is that the adolescents and adults and all, they have more of COVID appropriate behavior because they are more easy to I think practice that. Expecting a young child to do that would be I think we are probably expecting too much when we are not doing it.
But what do you feel? If you explain to a child who is 6 years or 7 years how to wear it properly, he or she will be able to do it. I
So-
think they will tell their parents also
So they would
that
be-
how to put a mask while they're going
So
out.
that would need, only thing is that the mask sizes and other things would need a greater degree of customization and appropriate handling, which the child with his his or her activities may find it a little bit that's going to interfere. So that's what we mean by that. It's likely and it has to be under supervision. That's the key thing.
Thank you, Jayashree and Rakesh. So I would again request attendees to keep on sending us the questions on WhatsApp, because we are going to take all the questions which are going to come on WhatsApp or on YouTube. And kindly send your questions on 78943999997, or you can write your questions in the YouTube as a message and we'll get back to you. So now let's go to some common guidance for healthcare professionals. So my first question goes to Tanu. You are running a OPD or a clinic or a nursing home or a ER. How do you triage a child who reports to you in the outpatient in this type of COVID?
So actually, our triage starts even before the patient comes to us in the OPD. So, when these appointments are given to these children, there is also the way that they can take an online consultation, especially if the call center person finds out that the child is having fever. So we encourage many people to reach out via online consult. That reduces the risk of transmission of infection to others, and it also reduces the parents to come to the hospital. So that is one form of triage which we do. The second thing is that to try and keep your immunization and well baby clinic appointments separately, so that you don't mix your ill patients with your well patients. And third, as soon as the child enters into the OPD cluster, the CCO or the secretary tries to find out what is the problem. And if they find that the child is having fever, or any other acute illness, then we try and keep that child in a separate area of the OPD, so that a distance is kind of maintained. Also, people can also stagger appointments so that there's not a lot of crowding in the OPD at one point in time. And then once these children enter into the room, then it is important to keep the child a little separate, far off from the table, and we make sure that we are always wearing the mask. And that is very important, that the healthcare personnel should be wearing the mask properly. And there's often a custom that as soon as the child goes out, they lower the mask, which is actually incorrect, because whatever virus is circulating in the air, you can get infected. So once you wear a mask, you wear it for 4 to 6 hours, and then you remove it to have water or something. That's very important. And then these appointments should be short. Pulse oximetry should be checked for all children. That is very important. And also it's better to keep these children, examine them in their mother's lap, so that they don't go and contaminate the bed, etc., as far as possible. So all these things one can do to reduce the risk. Because what healthcare professionals also need to understand is that even though they may have been vaccinated against COVID-19, they may have taken both the doses, they will still have to use the same degree of precautions when they are seeing children in the second wave as compared to the first wave. That's important because we know that breakthrough infections, despite vaccination, can occur. And also, they have the responsibility to prevent this infection from spreading to other people, healthcare personnel, which are there, whether it is the secretary, whether it is the nurses. So, they also have to be advised about appropriate behavior. And the third thing is that they have to prevent the transmission of infection from the patients to other patients who are coming to see the doctor. So this is what people should generally do in an OPD setting. And of course, in ER, like most hospitals now have a ER in which there is a separate area for acute illness, where these patients come and they are seen by people who are wearing a little higher degree of protection as compared to patients without acute illnesses and non-COVID illnesses, which are separated in another area.
Tanu. Let me ask Sushil. Sushil, what precautions should be taken? We are seeing a lot of patients in the children OPD. What precautions should be taken by healthcare professionals there?
Yes, sir. So the first thing is, I'll repeat or re-emphasize what Tanu has said. One is more teleconsultation, less of a physical appointment in OPD, staggered appointment. And there may be a screening by a person before entry of the patient in the OPD area, and no overcrowding. And equally important is that the doctor or pediatrician or a physician who is seeing the child should wear appropriate PPE, because we are very sure that PPE prevents infection. So mask and face shield are very important preventive measure. Then important thing is that while doing the auscultation, instead of auscultating in front of the child, it should be go behind the child and put your stethoscope anteriorly on the chest, here, and posteriorly. Because you might have heard that pediatricians are at more risk of developing infection, because he or she is exposed to a child who is not wearing the mask, to a parent, mother or father, who is keeping the child in the lap. So he is at a given point of time exposed to multiple people. So that's why while doing the auscultation, if it is mandatory, do it from behind. Don't try to look for the throat at that time unless it is really indicated, because that will produce a cough and aerosol, and if child is by any chance infected, will transmit the infection to the physician. Then frequent sanitization, including hands as well as your pen and your stethoscope. These are the precautions which we should observe to reduce the infection among pediatricians.
So, as a healthcare professional, despite the fact, as Tanu said, you are vaccinated, don't assume that you will not get infection. You have to take all precautions, use N95 mask, do sanitization, maintain social distancing, and follow instructions as Sushil was mentioning while you are working in the outpatient. So, getting a vaccination does not give you, we will talk about that in the later part, does not give you immunity against getting infection. Remember that. So let me ask now Rakesh. Rakesh, how do you decide that this child who has come to the emergency can go to home isolation?
Okay, yeah. So I think these principles of triaging and initial evaluation have been elucidated, and we're going to be later on talking about the assessment of the disease severity And as the spectrum would be, we would have asymptomatic kids as well as those who have mild, moderate, or severe illness. And the home isolation would be reserved for children who have either asymptomatic, they've just been detected because somebody else in the family had tested positive. And many or other scenarios, maybe there are children who are supposed to undergo certain procedures and they may have been tested before that and they may not have any acute condition per se, but are detected to have COVID infection based on the test that we mentioned. So the children who are asymptomatic or mild would be candidates for home isolation, provided there would be certain caveats that the caregivers should be able to be look after the child. They are able to follow certain precautions. There's a certain degree of monitoring that they possibly could be doing, and also have access to healthcare in case there is emergency or the child develops any worsening of symptomatology, which predominantly what we are looking at would be general danger signs as we talk about in young children, infants and young children. There could be worsening respiratory status, excessive cough, breathing difficulty, fast breathing, any change in the sensorium or feeding patterns. These would be the key things that they should be able to monitor. The second thing is it would be desirable to have a connect with the treating physician where that help is available. There should be a helpline available and somebody could at least remotely monitor whether how they are doing, maybe once a day or twice a day, and be available for responding to the parents' concerns. That these would be preferably be the prerequisites. Similarly, there would be a set of children who have underlying diseases, underlying chronic diseases, children with congenital hearts. There may be others who have been undergoing, let's say, cancer chemotherapy or other treatments. And they may be scenarios where they are again detected to be having COVID and they may not be symptomatic due to COVID or have only mild symptoms. Now, that's a at-risk group for maybe more severe manifestations later on. But this group, again, if there is adequate monitoring, the capacity available at home could be candidates for the home isolation. At the same time, one would need certain criteria on which you need to monitor. So those are the things that we would like to emphasize.
Thank you, Rakesh, for telling us how do you decide this child can go home for home isolation? How do you monitor and manage the child in home isolation? And what is the responsibility of the treating doctor while the child is at home? So thank you, Rakesh, for covering all these aspects on home isolation. So let me ask Sushil, suppose a child is moderately sick and you decide to admit that child in the hospital. Should we keep one of the parent with the child? And what should we do? How do we decide who will stay with the child in the hospital?
Yes, sir. One is that if child is very sick, requiring intubation, ventilation, intensive care, then possibly child can be kept there because he is not aware about the circumstances. But if child is moderately sick, he has anxiety as well as a physical ailment, and in that case, if one of the parents are there, then the child is more at ease. That's why, as an advocate of child health, we should allow the parents, after explaining to the family that there is a distinct possibility that the attendant may get infection, but we try that if they can be kept in a separate isolated room with the child only, and due precautions like we provide a PPE to the mother or father if they are negative. If they are positive, then there is no problem. So preferably, depending on the circumstances, we should allow one of the parents to stay with the child so that it will take care of the child's physical needs as well as mental needs.
Thank you, Sushil. So I think at this point of time, there are a lot of questions which are there on the WhatsApp call. So I'm going to ask those questions to all the panelists. First question goes to Rakesh Lodha. Rakesh, what is the ideal time for doing the RT-PCR test in a child who is exposed to a positive person in the family?
So I think if we have to look at the ideal time for diagnosis, so I think optimally it should be if the child becomes symptomatic, and if the exposure is prolonged, I guess one may just be looking at a time period or let's say the child is symptomatic, we would preferably do the test. Occasionally, if let's say we know that there's been an exposure and the child remains asymptomatic, and we just want to be sure that the child is not infected, then the preferable time to test, possibly, again, this would be based on some of the data from adults and modeling exercises that have been done based on these kind of studies, would be beyond day 5. So if I say a child remains asymptomatic and we test beyond day 5, maybe let's say preferably around day 7, day 8, and the test is negative, then the probability of this child turning out to be positive because of that exposure, which is now discontinued, would be remote. So I think we need an interval between this. If the exposure is ongoing, then the child kind of remains at risk. And if we are going to not use that data or whatever that test result is and not really change the exposure, then probably it may not mean much to just test a child who's not showing up any symptoms.
Okay, so there is another one question which relates to mother and newborn. Mother is RT-PCR positive and the baby is born. At what time the test should be done? I think Indian Academy of Pediatrics, FOXY, NNF has guidelines which are published. And if that child is getting discharged on day 3 or 5 from the hospital, term baby, you can do the test at that point of time. You must continue giving breastfeeding. Breastfeeding and mother and baby to the baby must be continued, but the mother must take precautions that she must do hand hygiene, she must wear a mask and keep on giving breastfeeding to the baby. So that is very important. It should not happen that a mother is RT-PCR positive and breastfeeding is not being given to the baby. Even in few of the hospitals where kangaroo mother care is being practiced for low birth weight babies, that can be practiced by taking adequate precautions. So KMC also should be continued if the mother is COVID positive and you have a healthcare facility where the mother can give kangaroo mother care. She can be advised to do kangaroo mother care. Now, in addition to this, there are questions. Sushil, there is a question for you. Can the children be isolated with either of the parents if the parents are negative? Child is positive, parents are negative. What should be done?
Yes, sir. As I told earlier, that the children between say 5 to 10 years of age, there is a lot of anxiety. Along with that, there is an infection-related issue. So in those situations, it is preferable that the child stays with the family or family members after with due precautions and after explaining to the family. Because if we keep a 6-year-old child separately in a separate room or in a ward, it is very difficult to manage this patient if he is only moderately sick. So that's why after explaining to the family, explaining to the this thing PPE, use of PPE, we preferably try that the attendant who is negative doesn't come in contact with other people other than the child. So it should be allowed.
Sushil, there is another one question which is what are the chances of reinfection in children? One infection and then reinfection in children.
It's not very clear, but it is documented that in adults it may happen in a very small proportion of patients. The same thing will be applicable in pediatric patients also, I think so.
So there is another one question which relates to your pulmonology. It says if a COVID patient child is at home isolation and child complains of cough with normal saturation with no distress, what should be done? Can we give nebulization to the child?
If the child is already on nebulized medication, then you can continue. Otherwise, during this pandemic, we should try to avoid all procedures which produce aerosol, including nebulizer. So if your child is suffering from asthma, preferably give meter dose inhaler and salbutamol inhalation or say steroid inhalation. There is no point of stopping it. Preferably give it by MDI and spacer. There may be a group of patients who are getting some nebulized medication for which MDIs are not available. In those situations, with all due precautions, the attendants should continue to give these medications, but try to avoid nebulizer as far as possible.
So Rakesh, there is a question for you. A child has suffered a moderate degree of COVID infection and he is discharged from the hospital. His next vaccination is due. What should be done for the vaccination?
So I think we need to wait for complete recovery of the child, and thereafter the vaccination could be resumed. It may generally be, maybe we may wait for a couple of weeks after the child's recovered, and we kind of get back to the immunization schedule.
So, Tanu, you listen to
Yes,
the
sir.
question. So, what should be done? Suppose a child is now due for getting his
Booster.
vaccine, which is MMR, 15 to 18 months of age.
So then the child can take the vaccine as soon as recovery has happened. Unless the child received some medication, like for example, if the child had severe disease and received steroids for a long period, then one would delay this live vaccine. But otherwise, one should not delay vaccination for too long a time. As soon as the child recovers, all vaccines can be given.
Okay. So there are a lot of questions which are related to like management of a child. So we'll come to that very shortly. Okay, so at this point of time, let me ask Dr. Rakesh Lodha, because many of the questions which are asked in the WhatsApp relates to the management. So may I request Dr. Rakesh Lodha to share what is the treatment algorithm which is to be followed for management of COVID infection in children? Rakesh Lodha. Rakesh.
Okay, I think the slides are visible. And so I think the first point kind of starts with the point that the child is diagnosed to have COVID-19 by our tests. And we could classify into, asymptomatic, and which we already talked about, has to be either just be washed and at home. There would be mild illness, which is like just, sore throat, some bit of rhinorrhea cough, so just like any upper respiratory infection. And there are no fast breathing, and there are no other signs which may suggest that there could be any severe illness. Moderate illness would include again fast breathing, and we could use the WHO criteria for fast breathing in the ARI program. And there are no signs of severe pneumonia or severe illness. The severe illness would be also be including those which are the critical illnesses which come defined by the WHO, including ARDS, sepsis, septic shock, MODS, and MISC would be a separate category. So that will be probably, if time permits, we may be talking later. Or there would be pneumonia with cyanosis or low saturations, increased respiratory efforts, grunting, severe retractions, and lethargy, somnolence, or seizure. So based on this, we could be looking at mild illness. It's essentially home isolation, supportive care, adequate hydration, and ensuring appropriate feeding. Child having fever, we give paracetamol 10 to 15 milligram per kg per dose for maybe at every 4 to 6 hourly intervals if required, and a home monitoring plan and a mechanism to report to a health facility or a healthcare provider in case the child has any worsening or danger signs. In moderate illness, again, it would be preferable to admit. And again, these most of the time the admissions would be to common facilities. Most of the places may not be having a separate pediatric COVID facility, so it would have to be there. And one just needs to make sure that the monitoring and treatment plans are well settled so that the treating team can administer that treatment. One may continue with feeds if the child seems to be accepting and there's not the respiratory rates are not very increased in child's accepting and can be given safely. Otherwise, IV fluids may have to be given. We need to make sure that the hydration has to be optimal, particularly avoiding overhydration and dehydration. Antipyretics continue. If we suspect a bacterial infection, then only we need to add a antimicrobial. Otherwise, one would just do the supportive care. If this monitoring has to be appropriate, saturation is dropping below 94%, one would start oxygen, and one would consider steroids if there is a rapid or a downhill course or a rapid decline in the saturations. Severe illness, again, these children should be admitted, and some of those means those who have features of ARDS, sepsis, shock, or multi-organ dysfunction would be have to be admitted to ICU or HDU. And even some of the other children may need support in a HDU or ICU because they may need some respiratory support like NIV or high flow nasal cannula, which very often may be available only in these setups. One would need a more comprehensive evaluation for organ failure, looking for thrombosis, any features of HLH, particularly in the ones who have critical illness. Here again, one would be a child who's having hypoxemia, one would be considering steroids and consider remdesivir, even though remdesivir, the evidence is, there are no direct evidences in children. Whatever's available in adults seem to suggest some benefit in the overall duration of illness, but there doesn't seem to be any, doesn't confer any survival benefits. So again, these would be, let's say, emergency kind of use, restricted only to those who have severe illness. One would consider empiric antimicrobials, particularly in those children who have features of shock, appropriate oxygen therapy, target saturations beyond 94%, particularly in the initial phase. And once stable or children who are on ventilator, we may use appropriate ventilation strategies and we may lower our targets of oxygenation to prevent lung injury. Slightly older children who may be able to cooperate awake prone positioning, which again has been talked, evidence has been there from adults, which seems to help. The same thing may help in improving the oxygenation. General features for care of critically ill, restrictive fluid therapy to make sure that they don't get into overload, adequate monitoring and appropriate organ support. Suppose child has renal dysfunction, may require renal replacement therapy. So this is, and again, ARDS, again, these general approaches remain. And as we would do for another scenario where the child gets into ARDS or shock, only thing we need to remember is that we need to be able to evaluate a child with shock for myocardial dysfunction. And if that's the case, then one may avoid fluid boluses, or if the assessment is that still there may be hypovolemia, a very careful administration and constantly looking for any signs of worsening. Early inotropic support, and we need to monitor for fluid overload, try and prevent it, and if it happens, then manage it appropriately. So this is in brief
Thank you,
about...
thank you, Rakesh. So at this point, I would re-emphasize, though we are working in a hospital, which is tertiary care hospital, we need to know moderate disease, severe disease, and mild disease. But we know in children, majority of the children are asymptomatic while they get COVID infection. That is bullet number one. Second is, even if they have illness, it will be only mild illness which will be there, which will be self-limiting with maybe some antipyretic, and the child will become all right. Very few children who are symptomatic. I would ask Sushil to tell us, children who are symptomatic, how many percentage of these children are going to be moderate or severely sick? You have seen a lot of children who get admitted in our hospital in trauma center and NCI Jajjar. Sushil.
To those who say, Dr. Devarari has already clarified that majority will be asymptomatic, maybe 60-70%, or very mildly symptomatic. Those who are 20-30% who are symptomatic, less than a 1 to 3% will have a moderate or more severe disease. So it will be very small proportion of patients, children, who will require hospitalization, or a very, very small proportion who will require a ICU care.
So can I have Jayashri on screen?
Yes, sir.
So do you agree with what we are saying, Jayashri?
Yeah, I
And
absolutely
Tanu?
agree with what Professor Kabra has said, sir. Our experience at PJ was also very, very similar. About 60 to 65% of the children were asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. And it was a very small, minuscule proportion who were moderately sick. And as sir said, about 1 to 2% were the ones who actually required ICU care. So therefore, that is a very heartening aspect of the disease in children. So the burden still is of the mild and the asymptomatic illness. But this experience is from the early pandemic, that is the first wave. Now then, this perception is looking similar, but there are certain changes, as how Tanu explained in the initial opening remarks. I think once we analyze the data, probably this thing will become clearer. And also, one needs to remember, like for AIMS and PGI, we are tertiary centers. So we are basically seeing most of the referred cases which come to us. So maybe it's quite possible that the sickness proportion is higher when they come to us. But when we look at the data as a large, when ICMR looks at the data, probably the clarity will be much better.
Let me ask Tanu. Tanu is seeing patients in Mumbai during the second wave. Tanu, tell us what are the danger signs, red flag signs, which we need to remember that this child is really sick. Tanu?
Yes. So while I agree that the symptoms have been more in this second wave, but 95% of the children get better. So, so we must understand that the disease in children is still milder as compared to adults. Now, when we counsel parents, what we really tend to tell them is one is of persistent fever. Because what generally happens in COVID, most children, their fever goes away by second or third day. But if the fever is not getting better by day 4 or day 5, that is the time the child needs to be re-evaluated to see whether this fever is because of COVID or is there any other alternative diagnosis, because there may be some other infections which may also present like COVID, and especially if the throat swab has not been done. The second thing is if the child is dull, especially that's true for small children, if the feeding goes down, if the activity level goes down, that is the second thing. Third thing is we tell parents to look at the breathing and tell them about the respiratory rate cutoffs, ask them to monitor breathing, and it's possible to monitor the respiratory rate of the child even on teleconsultation. So we always do that. Rapid breathing is a danger sign, and then finally fall in the oxygenation. So we tell parents, and sometimes this is very panic driven because parents don't apply the pulse oximeter to the child properly, and they say the saturation is 85% or something, and the child looks well. So we always ensure that we ask them to put the pulse oximeter in front of us if we are doing a teleconsultation, so that we can see whether the trace is proper or not. And we also sometimes the pulse oximeter may not be working well, and that leads to unnecessary panic. So we ensure that. But in short, the danger signs are persistent fever beyond day 4, day 5, decreased activity and dullness, poor appetite, rapid breathing, and fall in oxygen saturation to below 95%.
5 in number. 5 you said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes.
Fever which is persisting, that is 1. Not feeding, fast breathing, drop in saturation, and decreased activity. So these are 5 danger signs which mean we need to. And then you are right. If the parents are complaining of fall in saturation, we have to ensure that the pulse oximeter is put right in a right manner. Child is not having fever at that point of time, and it is a good signal even on a finger pulse oximeter that you are able to see a plethysmographic wave or bar display which is covering, and it is a good display which is there. Otherwise you don't believe that, and then it has to be recorded for more than 1 minute. It can't be for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and the parents are getting into panicky reaction. So I think this re-emphasizes another very important point while you are treating children with COVID infection. Giving 5 to 7 minutes to the family, talking to them, as Tanu is doing on telemedicine, or if they are coming in a healthcare facility, talking to them, explaining to them, good communication and what has to be done, and they understand that, it will make sure that the child will be cared at home in the right manner, as we expect as a healthcare professional or a pediatrician. Now, there are a lot of questions, Rakesh and Sushil, on management. I'm going to ask that. First is, it relates to, someone is asking any role of methylene blue inhalation in COVID infection. Rakesh?
So I think there have been reports of, but I don't think there's any evidence to support the use of these in COVID. I think
Tanu-
others could add. Tanu
Tanu or Jayashree, have you heard of this methylene blue?
Yes, it was probably initiated here in Mumbai, but there's no evidence to support the use of this drug in COVID-19.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I second them, sir. No
Thank
evidence.
you. Thank you, Jayashri and Tanu. Sushil, what is the role of Remdesivir and what are the indications for use in children of Remdesivir?
Remdesivir is an antiviral drug. It has some antiviral activity in vitro, but there are no safety as well as efficacy data in children below 19 years of age. But at the same time, there are randomized controlled trials on large number of adults, which also suggests that there is no survival benefit. And that's why WHO suggests that it doesn't have any role. But being a pediatrician, we are seeing that our adult patients treating adults, they are using remdesivir and they are convinced that it works. So on pediatricians, there are two responsibilities. One is that we should not be depriving children of some benefit of a medication, and at the same time, we should not unnecessarily be using a medication and causing harm to a child. So that's why, as of now, despite no evidence, a middle path or a compromise is that we may use it if a patient is sick and has come to us in the early, say, first 3 days of onset of symptoms. We can use it till we need to generate more data for pediatric patients.
So that means the child has to be sick.
Sick and he has come early. Say if I administer it on day 10, then probably it may not have any effect.
So we should not make parents run for getting this drug,
Yes.
which is going out of market into black market, and we are creating panic in whole of the society. So it is required in few conditions, and then it has to be given IV. Child has to be admitted, and as we have heard, Government of India is trying to make sure that it is going to be there in COVID healthcare facilities where adults and children are getting treated. It should not be given at home. Am I correct, Sushil?
Yes, sir. And we should be sensitive enough that if this drug is not available in hospital and we are giving a prescription to a father or mother and who are roaming around here and there and spending a lot of money, and even you might have seen that they are spending whole night so that in the morning the drug shop opens and then they get the medication. So as we are aware that it doesn't have any survival benefit as of now in adults, so we should not be creating panic amongst the parents
So,
and black marketing of these drugs.
so there is a question by Dr. Anand Patel from Gujarat. Again, Sushil. He is asking what is the role of favipiravir in children.
Again, there is no role, no pediatric data, and no role even prevention or in the treatment of COVID infection.
So again, there is another question. I am going to give the answer. What is the role of azithromycin, ivermectin, and other antibiotics which we gave for COVID mild infection? No role. Everyone agrees or disagrees, or there is no?
Absolutely no role.
No role. Okay. So, so there is a question which again it goes to Rakesh or maybe Jayashri can answer, that in a PICU you have admitted a child who is sick child in the PICU. First of all, in our hospital is a policy that we will do RT-PCR or a test, CB-NET test before the child is admitted to PICU. But suppose the child turns positive in the PICU. So how do you do cohorting and what do you do in the PICU?
So maybe so I think in most of the, it depends, so there may be like our ICU, we would have let's say it's an open kind of an ICU. So there we would essentially need to take all the infection control practices, in which during last 1 year we are presuming, even though these kids are tested, we presume that these children still may be having COVID, and we take appropriate respiratory protection. any aerosol generating procedure, we are taking, using the appropriate PP in addition to what we may generally we use. And in case a child turns out to be positive, and that does happen once in a while, either it's a evolving thing or initial sampling missed it, or maybe we do allow the attendants and the parents initially may be negative, but they subsequently turn positive. And while handling the child, or there may be another contact which the child may turn positive. In that scenario, we just need to make sure that the child continues to get the care that is being done while we arrange for appropriate, let's say we have a separate COVID care facility, we have ICU facilities there. So we would have this child shifted in a safe manner to that particular facility. Once that is done, we make sure that the surface disinfection and other things are taken care of. If an option is available, then one may preferably have this child in an isolation room. And again, that's mainly to cut down the risk to maybe other children within the ICU, and to some extent to the staff. The staff are supposed to take all precautions for all the children. And maybe I think we'd request Dr. Jayashree to add.
Yeah, Jayashree, you want to add?
Yeah, most of the things, protocol which Rakesh mentioned are very similar what we follow. So we test most patients, almost all the patients before we take to ICU. But as he said, there may be some who may slip the net and we may get a positive test later on. So we have an isolation which is outside our main PICU. So immediately we cohort the child in that isolation. And the staff, of course, they all have PPs. The ICU is the institute has guidelines. So ICU, which is non-COVID, also has proper PP, which the staff wears at all time. So the risk to the staff is minimal in this situation. It's more of anxiety and panic of detecting a COVID positive child within the ICU where there are all non-COVID children. So we cohort immediately into an outside isolation, then get in touch with our COVID regional hospital, and then we safely transport the child to that facility, and then get the room sanitized, and that's all. There is no risk assessment done for healthcare workers because they are already in their PPs. So these are the precautions that we do.
So I think again there is a question on role of antibiotics, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin. We said there is no role. Let me ask Sushil, what is the role of homeopathic and Ayurvedic COVID in children?
There are a lot of Ayurvedic preparations and some homeopathic preparations like arsenic, album, and all those things. There is no scientifically carried out investigations which suggest that they prevent or they treat this COVID infection. As of now, I would say that there is no role of so-called COVID care treatment from homeopathic or Ayurveda.
Sushil, there is another one question. COVID in children, sir, inhaled Budecort, any role?
There is no role of for the care of COVID patient or COVID infection. But if a patient is already on budesonide, this is an inhaled steroid for asthma, that should not be stopped because there may be a fear that if I give steroids, then viral infection will spread. So those who are asthmatics on inhaled steroid, oral steroids, or other drugs, they should continue. But there is no role as far as curative treatment for COVID infection is concerned.
Okay, one
So
question.
can I add to
Yeah, Tanu, yes.
So I think the question came from the adults trial, where they found that using Budecort 800 micrograms per day there was a randomized control trial which reduced the symptomatology and reduced hospitalizations, and there was also a principal trial in this respect. So yes, for treatment of mild COVID infection, there is now increasing use of Budecort, but as far as children are concerned, we don't have any data, because all these trials were conducted in adults who were above the age of 18 years. And sir, there is one more point which I want to mention here, because when children have COVID, it's usually the parents also who have it, and they are being treated by their physicians, and they are being given all these drugs. So the question is that should we give these drugs for children? And second, the adults are undergoing a lot of investigations like CBC, CRP, D-dimer, IL-6, CT scan, and they often ask that should we get the same done for the child too? So we should always counsel them that most children will get better on their own and they don't need any of these investigations. Because otherwise, apart from giving them all these drugs, they also get these tests done for the child.
Yeah, very good. I think, Tanu, you rightly mentioned a lot of people get the inflammatory markers done, and it is like over investigation and then treating the investigation rather than clinically what the child has. So I think we have to go with the clinical condition of the child, treat that rather than the investigations which have to be treated.
Yeah, no, I
Rakesh,
think I was just adding to the budesonide story, and I think the trial or the data, final data still have to come out, which would look at, people who had mild or moderate disease and whether hospitalization or mortality is, that it has any effect. Currently, they're just kind of looking at recovery times, and there seems to be some evidence in favor of these reported recovery times. And again, most of these patients were administered budesonide around day 6, day 7. So certainly not in the early part, and again, data only from adults. So one may just wait and watch.
so Jayashri, a question for you. If a child has fever on day 2, 102 and 103, not responding to paracetamol, can the parents give mefenamic acid or ibuprofen? Jayashri.
Yes, sir. Normally,
Fever not responding to paracetamol.
yeah. So, in general, we like in PGI, in our OPD practice, we refrain from prescribing mefenamic acid or ibuprofen for fever. We generally stick to paracetamol because it is safer, and usually the platelet dysfunction and other things that we might see with some kind of severe infection. So therefore, we generally try to counsel them for tepid sponging and paracetamol. Very often, the dosing of paracetamol is not rightly given by the parents, so we check the dose that they have given it properly, and we advise them to check fever every 6th hourly and continue with paracetamol.
So
But if the
paracetamol. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
there are two strengths of paracetamol which also has to be kept in mind, the 125 and the 250. So these are some of the instructions that we need to give carefully to the parents. And if it doesn't respond, then maybe mefenamic acid. But somehow we in PGI, we refrain from prescribing very generously mefenamic acid or ibuprofen for fever.
So Tanu.
We stick more to paracetamol.
Tanu.
Yes, sir.
So,
Response to this, yeah.
Same question. Fever 102, 3, not responding to paracetamol. Can the parents give mefenamic acid or ibuprofen? Tanu?
We do use ibuprofen in our practice over here because there's a lot of fever phobia amongst the parents, and then they look at giving antibiotics or some other things as fever remedies. So we use ibuprofen, not mefenamic acid, because data is more as far as ibuprofen is concerned as an antipyretic. But generally, we use it in the first 2 or 3 days. If the child is continuing to have fever after day 3, then sometimes giving these medications round the clock gives a false sense of security to the parents that the child is fine, and therefore we don't use it, because then after day 3, day 4, if the child is continuing to run high grade fever, then the child definitely needs evaluation and not just symptomatic treatment. But yes, we do use ibuprofen in the first 2 or 3 days when fever is particularly high. But we make sure that we counsel the parents that this is the maximum dose you can give. This is the maximum time between the two doses. It has to be given on full stomach, and hydration should be maintained.
Yeah, Sushil.
Two, we should be aware that one is that it may be a COVID infection, and now this is the season when dengue and other tropical infections may be there. So in those situations, if you are very sure that this is a COVID infection, no other infection in form of dengue or no co-infection, in those situations, even then you would prefer paracetamol as a first line antipyretic. If you want to use, you should be aware that in other conditions, ibuprofen may create some trouble. So use it with caution.
Sushil, there is another one question for you. How do we differentiate between a viral infection and a COVID infection in the initial stages of symptoms?
It's very difficult. Theoretically, I can say that those with a COVID has a more of a throat infection, moderate grade fever, and occasionally there may be a gastrointestinal symptoms. while in the other viral infection like RSV and others, there may be some more of a coryza or cold. But all these are very soft and they cannot be used for differentiation between the COVID or non-COVID.
So let me ask Rakesh, uh, in that 1% out of the moderate and sick symptomatic children, suppose you have to use steroids. What is the indication? Which children should be used? Steroids should be used.
So again, I think this would be based on data that comes from adults and
Thoda loud bolo.
the data which would be coming from adults, and it would be reserved for children who have hypoxemia. That's one where one may be using steroids. Again, and this is likely to be used in a scenario where the illness is already beyond 4 or 5 days of illness, and there may not be too much of viral replication happening. And that's typically how one may be looking at it. And if a child is into ARDS and in that kind of a setting, while the trials in adults have really not shown much advantage for or benefit from steroids, and potential for harm may also be there, one at times does so again, once there is a full-fledged ARDS, then possibly the steroids may not be having any role.
Now, I want to give one message here that steroids never be given in
There's a lot
early
of disturbance,
illness.
ma'am. Nothing is audible.
You kindly keep yourself muted. Tirumal, keep yourself muted. Yeah, Tanu, bolo.
So, an important message we should give from this platform is to not use steroids as antipyretics, because that's happening in adult COVID. That patients are getting steroids on day 4, day 5, they're having high fever, which is actually the stage of viral replication, and it may harm. Even the recovery trial showed that if steroids were used earlier than 7 days, the patients had a worse outcome. So, therefore, steroids have to be used in very selective circumstances and in hypoxic patients and not otherwise.
Okay, so one more question to you, Tanu. How commonly you see loose stool as a clinical manifestation of COVID infection?
We see it quite commonly, but generally these patients don't have florid gastroenteritis. Like, they'll have 3-4 loose stools a day, and maybe they will be erratic. They'll have it for one day, they won't have it the next day. So it's not like acute gastroenteritis where the predominant presentation is, 10-15 loose stools a day. That is the kind of people I have seen, but I would ask others to share that comment, that question.
Okay, so let me go to the last part now. The question to you, Rakesh: should children below the age of 18 years need vaccination? And looking at the supply chain, who should get the first vaccination in kids below 18 years of age?
So I think the issue currently is about the vaccine availability. That would be one. The second would be available evidence in terms of clinical trials in children of various age groups, both for safety as well as efficacy. And what we need to remember at this time point when we are having a pandemic, I think one of the key concerns is to be able to target the group which is more likely to get sick or which has more severe disease and may contribute to mortality. And therefore, the let's say stratification in terms of targeting so various groups in with different phases of vaccination is what has been done. At this time point, we are not very clear whether the vaccination is going to prevent the risk of infection completely, which may otherwise have been important to cut down that chain of transmission. So I think we would probably have to wait for some time while the data emerges, as well as the enough vaccine supply is there to consider immunization in children. We heard from all the panel members that the infection in children is usually mild, asymptomatic or mild, and very few children actually get sick. Most of those who get sick or get into an ICU setting, most of them would be recovering with adequate supportive care, even though we don't have any specific antiviral drugs or any specific therapies. So in that case, I would still feel that we would make it an evidence-based approach, and we possibly could be waiting for some time before we go in for vaccination for children. Still should be, I think we still have a large population to cover who have a much greater risk of dying due to, if they get COVID, even with appropriate
But
treatment.
are there some trials which are happening in
So
children?
children, I think there are trials which have been initiated. The age has been extended down to 12 years, and I think there have been trials which are registered for the mRNA vaccines right from 6 months up to 11 years of age, and we would hopefully have data. Most of the vaccines do well in means have been done well in children, and most of the time the vaccination programs or vaccines are initially tested in children and then they are probably get extrapolated. Here it's been the other way around for the obvious reasons.
Thank you.
So-
Thank you, Rakesh. Last question is to Sushil. Sushil, what is the role of additional dosage of BCG or MMR to protect the children from getting COVID infection?
There's a lot of systematic review which suggests that BCG may be protecting, some say it is not protecting, MMR may be protecting, or measles may be protecting. That as of now, we can say that none of them have any protective or not protective role as far as COVID infection is concerned, and there is no role of giving additional doses of BCG, MMR, or measles vaccine as of now.
So I think my WhatsApp is all filled with lot of questions. Many of the questions are related to multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, and I don't think we will be able to cover all those questions at this point of time because we are running short of time. It is already 90 minutes. We'll arrange another webinar for taking questions on management in children very, very soon. So, how people are able to. So at the end, may I ask all our panelists to kindly tell one carry home message from the last 90 minutes of discussion, starting with Tanu.
So reinforce the behavior, protective behaviors like appropriate masking, social distancing. Tell the children not to go out, stay at home, and allay anxiety of the parents. That most children will recover and they need not be worried.
Jayashri. Jayashri.
He's muted.
So maybe Sushil.
Yes, sir. I would say that pediatricians to manage children with supportive care help in reducing panic and preferably not to give irrational treatment with all sorts of, whether it is a remdesivir, whether it is a favipiravir or ivermectin or unnecessary steroids.
Rakesh.
I think I would just add to this in terms of the appropriate infection control practices, which all healthcare professionals should be following, both in a inpatient as well as an outpatient setting. Remembering, I think we just need to take precautions universally, just as we used to have other universal precautions. I guess we need to adhere to these precautions. And rational treatment is what we would say. I think it's a little bit difficult to say that we are not going to use a certain medication than to use, but I think we need to keep that principle in mind that we don't need we should avoid doing harm, and just for the sake of using these medications, I think that's creating a lot of trouble and panic, and we shouldn't be extrapolating from adults and some of these practices.
Jayashri. So if she is not there, my message after listening to all of you is, number one, we should remember that majority of the children who would be getting COVID infection, it is going to be asymptomatic. Majority of them will have mild infection. It is very rare that they will land up with moderate or severe infection needing admission to the hospital. But we must make sure we communicate and counsel the family well, especially if they are going to do home isolation, what to be done, how to monitor the child, when do you approach to the hospital, And for that, telemedicine is going to be of immense value. And lastly, must remember the 5 danger signs which Dr. Tanu mentioned: high grade fever, child getting drowsy, decrease in activity, fast breathing, or saturation which is dropping down. But kindly make sure that the pulse oximeter is put right, and then there is a good display of the waves before you say the child is having hypoxia and needs admission to the hospital. And then maybe doing a teleconsultation, doing a video call, and looking at how the child is breathing may also make sure the family will realize whether the child is really sick to come back again to the healthcare professional. So that should be the advice. So counseling, communication, and then remember, children will keep on coming. Essential services have to be maintained for the mother, newborn, and the child. Immunization services should not suffer. Good nutritious diet should be given, because if we don't give good nutritious diet, especially during COVID infection, then what will happen is it will contribute to malnutrition or undernutrition in the child. So make sure adequate nutritious diet is given, hydration is maintained, and most of the time we need to talk to the family to make sure that they understand their child is going to be well. So looking at the number of questions which are there, I don't see there is any escape for Jayashri, Tanu, Rakesh Lodha, and Sushil Kabra that we have to do another webinar very quickly at this time of pandemic, which is related to multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, and maybe management questions which a lot of attendees are asking at this point of time.
Right, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining for the webinar. Thank you, Luigi. Thank you, Pushpa Chaudhary. Thank you, Dr. Vivek from UNICEF, who kept on collating all the questions from the YouTube and from WhatsApp, passing on to us. Thank you, each and everyone who were able to join us for this webinar today afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.